Great. So thank you, Allison, and thank you all for being here. As she said, my name is Eleanor. I'm going to be talking today about this question of what sticks and why in terms of investigating and designing for both change and persistence. You could also call this the case of restorative justice practices in the Chicago Public Schools. So before we get into what does stick, I want to first hear a little bit about people's experiences in the room about what has not stuck. So if you could just raise your hand if you work regularly in schools, in K-12 schools. Can you raise your hand? A few people. Okay, yeah. And keep your hands up. If you work in or with nonprofit organizations. Maybe a couple. Okay, keep your hands up. If you work in any organization at all. You work in any organization. Right? Okay, so now keep your hands up, please, if this organization that you're thinking of, that you work in or work for, has ever tried to do something new. Yes? Okay. Now, keep your hands up if you've ever experienced in a school, in a nonprofit, in a business, in a university, you've tried to do a new thing and it has not lasted. Has anybody experienced that? A lot of people, right? So I'm curious about what are some of the things that folks have experienced. So was anybody thinking about a technology, like maybe a piece of software that you designed or that somebody else designed that sort of got implemented and then kind of went away? Did anybody have a case of that? Yeah? Can you give us 2 sentences of what happened?
I'm blanking on the specifics, but did you have something?
Yeah, sure. The elementary school that I used to work at got smart boards that were not enough for every class, but like one per floor, and they ended up by like the year after they were bought being used as whiteboards.
Perfect example, right? Okay. What about anybody who's worked on a grant-funded project where you had a grant and then maybe the things you were funding didn't last? Anybody have an example of that? Yeah. Do you want to give me like 2 sentences? What happened?
So we worked on a transition from middle school to high school project, and so we had them create district math leadership teams, look at new curricular materials, try to get the kids talking to each other, and increase the cognitive demand of the classroom. And if you go back, I just happened to be in a school this past week, and they've changed to very procedural curricular materials.
You're like, where's our stuff? Didn't we talk about this?
Oh my gosh,
right.
What happened?
Yeah. So a lot of us have experienced this, right? And a lot of different kinds of things have trouble sticking, right? So whether it's a policy, whether it's a new name for something, whether it's like this new initiative, we're going to form a committee, right? All of these things we've seen. Sometimes you sort of try to get them going, and it's hard to sustain. And this is well documented in the literature, right? In thinking about the education context, we know that new reforms are adopted all the time. And this ranges from the federal level, if you think about the reauthorizations of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, through state level changes in funding, through district level, through school level adoptions of a new curriculum, a new technology, whatever it is, right? Happens all the time, and we know that lasting change is less common than attempts to bring about change. Sort of historically, there's been theorizing that the reason for that is because school reform efforts have not sort of permeated the core of teaching and learning. More recent research has suggested that's maybe not even as much the thing, especially with accountability policies. There is a tighter coupling. But even so, a lot of initiatives kind of fade away, they're abandoned, they're replaced. At the same time, some things do stick, right? So if you think about some technologies like are pervasive, they're everywhere, right? Certain kinds of metrics held a lot of influence in what organizations do. Some kind of policies, like I mentioned, accountability policies, right? Starting in the 80s, spreading from states to federal policies. And some of these things that stick are things that some of us in this room have put a lot of effort into trying to undo, right? Think about how sticky the sort of lecture-based, teacher-centered instruction is. How much work have folks put into trying to move away from that, but it seems to really have a stickiness to it. Also thinking about opportunity gaps by race and by class, right? There's all kinds of initiatives that are meant to be pushed towards equity, and yet we still see these big disparities. And the context that I'll be talking about today, exclusionary discipline is something that sort of really rose in popularity in the 90s with the with zero tolerance policies, and it's really been very sticky, very hard to undo in the Chicago public schools and elsewhere. So this is kind of a puzzle, I want to say, right? Like, things change all the time, but they don't change, but sometimes they do, right? So there's this question of what is it that makes certain patterns durable while others are transient? Or why is it that some shifts persist while others revert back to the status quo? In other words, what sticks and why, right? So I would also argue that this problem is under-theorized. So it's not under-documented. I think everyone knows, everyone in this room has kind of experienced it. There's lots of empirical factors that there's lots of great research about. It matters whether your leader is supporting the initiative. It matters whether the teachers buy into it. It matters whether the other things that you're also doing are coherent and align, like lots of things like this, right? I think this is absolutely right. A challenge with this list is it's sort of laundry listy, right? It's not totally clear how you know from this list whether the next thing is going to also matter or not. It's not clear what the relationship is between these factors. We do have some kind of theorizing, sort of thinking more broadly about this. I think that a lot of us have a sort of common sense that inertia is a big problem, right? That like people are inclined to keep doing the thing that they've been doing. I think that's true. I think there's also some kind of sophisticated thinking in certain research traditions about power, about thinking about the way that things stick because people who benefit from the way they are now are able to exert their power to keep them that way. I also think that's absolutely true. What I think is missing from these ways of thinking about it is mechanism. Is like, yes, these are broad generalizations that I think are absolutely true, but why is it and how is it that these patterns are occurring? I think knowing what you would need to get something to stick isn't the same as being able to do it, but it's sure difficult if you don't even know exactly what it is that you need. So that question of trying to understand what are the mechanisms that underlie and drive what sticks and why, that's really what I'm working on here today. And I want to argue that the stakes here are quite high, right? This is totally ubiquitous. Everyone in this room knows what we're talking about. If you think about how many millions of dollars in grant money has gone to creating beautiful, wonderful things that don't have the lasting impact that they're intended to because they don't last. It's also, I think, a real problem for thinking about moving towards equity. A lot of those things that got that grant funding were intended to make schools more just, to make them more equitable, and they're not having that impact in a long-lasting way, in part because I think we don't know what to do with this sort of puzzle about figuring out what sticks. So what I'm going to do today is first offer a sort of new theoretical lens, what I'm calling a more institutional lens, and I'm going to argue that this, I think, can help us in working on this problem a little bit more effectively. I'll show how I use the lens empirically to kind of reveal the mechanisms of persistence both for exclusionary discipline and for restorative justice practices. Then I'll also demonstrate how I use the same lens to design for greater sustainability. So thinking about how can I use this way of looking at things to design interventions that maybe have a greater chance of lasting. And finally, I'll discuss some implications for future research and practice. Great. So my new lens, it's sort of an old lens, right? They say there's no new thing under the sun. But what this is built on is institutional theorizing, institutional theory. And this is something that draws from organizational sociology and management science. Some of the really seminal work in institutional theory kind of articulated the power of kind of big macro-level cultural forces in shaping organizational structure. Documented this idea of a loose coupling between the formal structure that an organization sort of says is what they do and the actual daily activities that are sort of happening behind that. And there's also been a lot of research on how this sort of pattern of isomorphism, meaning things that look the same among organizations in the same field, and sort of the idea that these big cultural forces are shaping what is a legitimate kind of organization here. This has been applied a lot in educational contexts. I should have put citations, but there were so many, I was like, how do I even decide? And most of the applications of institutional theory in education are referencing kind of these three seminal ideas. There's some others, but this is the bulk of it. I think that we can use institutional theory to think about and investigate what sticks and why. So we kind of understand, just even intuitively, that institutionalization means that practices are woven into the fabric of daily work, and that institutionalized practices last at least until they become deinstitutionalized. And if we draw on a broader body of institutional literature, I think we can formalize this into an analytic lens for analyzing persistence and change. So this is what I'm calling the more institutional approach. So some of the core premises of this are that institutionalization is something that is visible and emanates from multiple levels. It's not only a macro level phenomenon, it's something that happens all across, from the sort of individual all the way up. That we can think about institutionalization alongside its counterpart of deinstitutionalization, and that that's something important for our understanding. That some of these markers, especially in the seminal literature about legitimacy, resistance to contestation, this outcome of decoupling, of isomorphism, that these are kind of markers of institutionalization. I sometimes say, like, it's like the X that marks the spot. You're like, I think there's probably institutionalization if we dig down here. But rather than thinking of these as a definition, I want to argue for a definition, and this is really rooted in Ron Jefferson's work from the 90s, as well as work by Jeanette Calevis more recently, is institutionalization means integration into one or more self-activating modes of reproduction. So I'll explain what I mean by that. My little joke here is that this approach is more institutional because it draws on more institutional literature. It draws on a wider array of insights that we can get from this research tradition. And also, I use more as an acronym to reference the fact that we're looking at modes of reproduction. So what does this mean? Self-activating, by that I mean it's a structure that kind of keeps itself going within its context without any extra support. And a mode of reproduction meaning it's something that produces and reproduces a particular pattern or outcome. So to make this more concrete, some common modes of reproduction here. I think it's worth noting that you can see these at different levels, right? You can think about policy itself at multiple levels, but you can also think about, how a professional norm might be a sort of macro level. What do we think about what it means to be a teacher generally? It might be that there's a resonant frame that's like really a sort of something local and cultural to a particular school, for example. They're also self-activating in different ways. So some are just sort of stable. So if you think about policy in the sense of like a legislative process where, once a law is passed, it's going to stay on the books unless some other thing happens to take it off. So it sort of has that natural continuity. Other ones are self-activating because they're repeating. They sort of have a natural cycle. So thinking about a routine, it's something that happens over and over again in an organization. Others are self-activating because there's some kind of positive feedback cycle. So thinking about professional norms, right? If I have an understanding of what it means to be a teacher, that's how I'm going to go about my work. And the other teachers around me are going to see how I'm acting, and they're going to say, right, that's a teacher, I'm a teacher, yeah, that's how I'm going to be too, right? And so by sort of enacting something and seeing how other people are enacting it, there's this kind of positive feedback loop that keeps things going. I want to contrast these ideas these structures that I'm calling modes of reproduction with what's not a mode of reproduction. And this is something that's temporary, something like a sort of targeted, we're going to work on this thing, we're going to get a grant for a certain amount of time just to work on this one project. Anything that's kind of like an effort over and above the everyday, that there's something extra going in and that something extra is going to be taken away at some point, that's not the mode of reproduction, right? And I think we can see a lot of these things that folks in the room maybe we're thinking of when we think about like grant, for example, right? Our grants are always time limited. They're always temporary. So the grant alone does not operate as a mode of reproduction. The question is, what are you doing during that time, and can you engage some of these other modes while you're there? So, taking this idea, I'm going to show you what it looks like to sort of apply this framework in an empirical context, in the context of school discipline, and show how I think it helps to reveal the mechanisms that underlie persistence and change. So, what does it mean to take a more institutional empirical approach? I think the first thing is that it gives us some language for sort of what is the analytic category of what am I trying to do here? Well, if I'm trying to understand what makes things last, if I'm thinking about sustainability, I can think about it as the study of institutionalization and deinstitutionalization. It can also sort of help then direct my case selection. If I know there are these sort of hallmarks, these like, X's that mark the spot, these are the things that probably are institutionalized, I can, that helps me know where to look if I want to understand these processes. Even more specifically, in terms of research design and data collection, I want to look at where those common modes of reproduction are operating, because that's where I think the action is going to be. That's where I think I'm going to see these sources of support. And finally, that the analysis is going to be about unpacking the mechanisms of what is actually going on here with this process, in this context, with this outcome, to understand how things are being supported or not. So, in my case, thinking about sort of school discipline and climate in the Chicago Public Schools, I was looking at both sort of traditional and exclusionary discipline and also restorative justice practices. Are people familiar with restorative justice practices? Most people. Cool. Okay, great. So to sort of speak briefly to exclusionary discipline, what I mean by this are disciplinary consequences that exclude students from classroom instruction. So that might be something like in-school suspension, where a student is still in the building but they're not in their regular classroom. It might be out-of-school suspension. It might be expulsion. These are all exclusionary consequences. In terms of the Chicago Public Schools, this is sort of a holdover from the formal zero tolerance policies that were in place for a long time. Those are not the formal district policies anymore, but the practices still remain. They were sticky. We know it just sort of feels like more research every day demonstrating that these consequences are assigned disproportionately, in particular to Black boys, also to Native students, also to Latino students, also to students with disabilities, also to LGBT students, lots of disproportionality. And that being assigned, experiencing an out-of-school suspension or exclusionary discipline is associated with a host of negative outcomes. So then on the flip side, thinking about restorative justice, in Chicago, these have been adopted in the schools largely sort of in response to outcry about the high suspension rates. And restorative justice refers both to a set of specific practices, so like a peace circle or a peer conference. It also represents a sort of underlying philosophy that can be applied in lots of ways. And overall, a restorative approach is focused on repairing harm to relationships rather than punishing broken goals. So what does this look like in terms of an institutional lens? So exclusionary discipline, it's longstanding, it's widespread, it's been resistant to contestation. So this suggests that it's probably pretty strongly institutionalized. Restorative justice has received more attention and funding in the last few years in Chicago. It's a really ambitious reform effort. It's something very different from what the sort of status quo is in most schools. And so because of that, I think it's sort of at risk for having this, this sort of same thing happen that we see happen in other contexts where we're like, oh, remember the 2010s when everyone was talking about restorative justice, right? And so this is sort of the question of like, will restorative justice practices become institutionalized in the Chicago Public School, or will it sort of be something that passes without having that impact? So I would say that those who are implementing them and advocating for them are seeking institutionalization. That's sort of a goal here. So the way I approach this, I did a comparative case analysis. I did field work in 3 CPS high schools. They were intentionally sampled to be very similar, except for variation in their degree of implementation of restorative justice practices. So they're all small, they're all predominantly African American, similar student achievement. But I had a sort of high implementing school, a medium implementing school, and a low implementing school. I did a bunch of observations. I was at the school a lot, and this was in the 2014-15 and 2015-16 school years. I did interviews with teachers, administrators, security staff, also folks that work at nonprofits that were partnering with the school, some central office administrators, and some artifact and document collection to kind of go along with that. And all of this was in service of looking for evidence about mechanisms of institutionalization, both for exclusionary discipline and for restorative justice practices. And to make that even more concrete, these on the left here, these sort of sites or modes of reproduction are the ones I mentioned that we sort of have reason to think are powerful in education contexts. And on the right are the data that I collected that hopefully would allow me to get at what was going on sort of at each of these sites. So, yeah.
Just a clarifying question. When you talk about site reproduction and modes of reproduction,
yeah.
What is being reproduced? Is it practices, or is it ideas, or is it models?
It could be any of those things.
Okay.
So, my claim about these, and I'm sort of using site and mode interchangeably at the moment. My claim about this sort of list on the left is that they are influential and could serve to reproduce a lot of different things. So
associated with these policies.
Exactly, right. So sort of depending on what is the content of your routine, right? That thing is going to be kind of produced and reproduced over and over again. But then that also, what I want to suggest is that creates an opportunity for if we could change the content of the routine, then that thing could sort of get produced and reproduced over and over again. Yeah, do you have a question?
And just a further clarification of
Yeah.
this notion of site, it's kind of like artifact, or I'm not sure exactly how to get my head around the use of those words, and reproduction. But is there also something to do here with, do you differentiate within these in terms of where the policy is coming from, in terms of closeness to implementation?
So are you saying across these different modes of reproduction, are there differences in how tightly linked they are to a policy or initiative?
To who does it? So for example, policy can come from a superintendent.
Yeah.
But actually, assistant principals at a school building are implementing that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I'm talking about where do they come from, because
Right.
it might have to do with how much you feel it's yours.
Yes. So, yes, I totally agree. So I am claiming that these are, that sort of, in a broad sense, these tell us, sort of where we might look, and that the questions of how is it operating in this setting for this initiative are sort of what we need to uncover by looking in that place. So in other words, I know I want to understand, well, what is the CPS policy on discipline and restorative justice? So, okay, I look at the school code of conduct, I look at the schools also have their written up little discipline policies, right? So that's a place that I'm going to look to understand what's going on with the policy piece of this, right? Yeah. Thinking about routines, I want to know what's happening in their meeting routines. I want to know what's happening in their discipline routines. So I'm going to look at those sites in order to understand, do I see ways that those routines seem to be supporting exclusionary discipline? Do I see ways that they seem to be supporting restorative justice? Yeah.
And so then within any one of these categories, it could hit multiple levels of an organization? So
Yeah.
you can have routines that are school-wide, routines that are in a classroom, routines that are... Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Any other clarifications before we keep going? Okay. We can get we can battle it out later on, but great. I want to make sure we're clear for the moment. Okay, beautiful. So today I'm going to talk about not all of these different modes, but I'll focus on the top 3, policy, routines, and metrics, to kind of show you what this analysis looked like. So to preview what I found, looking across these 3 schools, so I have Ruston as my high implementation school, Heritage is my medium implementation, and Southlake is my low implementation. Thinking about exclusionary discipline. I found that exclusionary discipline was strongly institutionalized in all of these schools. And I'll show you some evidence for why I say that. Thinking about restorative justice practices, I found moderate institutionalization at both the high and medium implementation schools. So I'm making a distinction between institutionalization and implementation. And weak institutionalization at Southlake, the low implementation school. And again, I'll show you some evidence for why I think this is the case.
This is high implementation of restorative justice.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. So thinking about policy. Did you have a question?
Over what time period were
Yeah.
you looking at?
So this is like this is not a longitudinal study. It's a snapshot. At the first two schools, at Ruston and Heritage, I was there during the 2014-15 school year, and at Southlake, I was there during the 15-16 school year.
Okay.
So that is important to keep in mind that there's some things that have shifted in the district since then, although a lot of things I would say are similar. Okay, so thinking about policy. So overall, what I found in terms of policy is that both exclusionary discipline and restorative justice practices are permitted by formal district policy. So officially, out-of-school suspension is a last resort, but generally the sort of framing of the policy is that exclusionary measures are recommended for the more serious type misconducts. So I'll give you an example of this. This thing, which I don't expect you to be able to read, but I just want you to see that it's a flow chart. This flow chart is part of a document that was sort of an addendum to the Student Code of Conduct from the 2014-15 school year that included, among other things, some guidance for educators about, well, when should I use what types of consequences? And in the lower left-hand corner, this little green box here, these things on the left, generally the way the flow chart works is these are sort of less severe and less serious things. This says, in those cases, you should assign an appropriate instructive, corrective, or restorative response. So here, like a restorative justice is sort of brought underneath the larger umbrella of instructive, corrective, restorative responses, and it's sort of seen to be appropriate generally in these sort of milder situations. On the right, this is the sort of part of the flow chart that's more serious kinds of infractions. Here, after providing a student with an opportunity to respond and contacting parents or guardians, determine whether suspension, whether out of school or in school, is appropriate, and then document that in Impact, which was at that time, it is no longer, the software that they used to sort of document all this stuff. So that's sort of the policy piece, right? Now I want to look a little bit at metrics. So discipline data is absolutely collected, it's logged, it's reported in CPS. In particular, the three pieces that get the most emphasis are student misconducts, in-school suspensions, and out-of-school suspensions. And I'll show you a little bit of this in a minute. The other metric that I was interested in looking for was, well, what are the ways that people are measuring, like, students' social and emotional well-being? Like, that's a sort of more restorative lens on, how students are doing. What I saw was that there's clinical evaluations happening in schools. There's students, particular students get referred to the social worker or the psychologist, whatever. They have a private assessment that's confidential. So there's that kind of evaluation. Other than that, things are pretty informal and unsystematic. People talk a lot about students and what they think is going on with students, but there's not sort of a systematic way of measuring what's going on for people in that way. So to just sort of illustrate this point about the discipline data, if you go on the CPS website right now, this is what you will find up there at the tippy top. It says metrics, right? This is a list of all the different kinds of metrics that the district collects that are made publicly available. And at the bottom there is suspensions and expulsions. And you can see there are sort of spreadsheets that you can download. That includes, for each school, how many misconducts of what level were recorded, how many in-school suspensions, how many out-of-school suspensions. So you can imagine that there's sort of an emphasis in terms of documentation at the school level on those particular metrics because they know that's what's going to be put on the website for everyone to see. Okay, and then thinking about routines. So there are a couple different kinds of routines that I looked at. One of them, logically enough, is discipline routines. The sort of analysis that I came to is that we could think about discipline routines as having two pieces, that there's like the getting in trouble part and there's the punishing part. So, and that these two pieces of a discipline routine are interdependent and interconnected. And I'll illustrate a little bit what I mean by that. The other thing that I found is that in where I saw restorative justice practices integrated into discipline routines, they're integrated in the punishment slot. So people who do restorative justice do not think of restorative practices as punishments. However, in the context of schools' existing structures, the place that it fits in is sort of the punishment place. And again, I'll kind of show what I mean. The other thing I spent a lot of time looking at was meeting routines, just sort of like who meets with who, when in the school. I saw that, so in particular, like grade level meetings and department meetings, although I went to various other kinds too. So student behavior is discussed informally all the time in these meetings, right? Like everybody walks in being like, you would not believe what so-and-so did last period, right? For sure. There's not really a lot of systematic, in the schools that I was in, I didn't see a lot of systematic interrogation of that. What I did see was that there's this sort of quarterly process where when it comes close to report card time, at all three schools, I saw this, there's a conversation in the grade level meetings about every student who is currently, like their current grade suggests they're going to get a D or an F in their class, and the teachers talk through like what's going on with the student, what would they need to pass, is there any possible way, like can you let them redo the test, can you let them submit late work. There's a conversation around the academic performance of students. And then finally thinking about classroom routines, I will say I didn't do as much systematic data collection here. I was mostly sort of more at the school and department level. But from what I could see, it's very variable. It's sort of every teacher kind of closes their door and they do their own thing, and some of those things are more restorative and some of them are less. So to dig in a little bit more to the discipline routines piece. Yeah.
I just have a quick question about the meeting routines. I'm a little unclear on who's in which meetings and which meetings you're referring to, because if it's a high school, right, multiple teachers have the kids,
right,
the same kid, right? But are these department meetings, are you looking across, subject matter areas or?
Yeah. So yes, the talking through students who are at risk of D's or F's, that's a grade level meeting conversation. The informal conversation about student behavior, I saw at both. These are pretty small schools. I didn't have that student this year, but I might have had him last year, and like, oh, I know, it was always, right, that sort of happens still. Thank you. Okay, so thinking about discipline routines, there's a lot here, and I'm going to talk it through. So this overall is what I'm referring to as a discipline routine cluster, and I should have put a citation up there. This comes from some organizational work by Kremser and Schreig in 2016. And basically the idea here is that within an overall sort of routine cluster, there are these different pieces of what's happening. On the left in green, there are these getting in trouble routines that I mentioned. The idea here is that the sort of input to a getting in trouble routine is there's some kind of student behavior, there's some kind of assessment that it broke a rule, and there's some kind of adult discretion to say, I'm going to address this, right? Then the way that might be addressed could take different forms. So it might be like, oh, no, you need to go back and get a late pass. It might be, I'm writing you up. Schools have different systems for writing up. It might be, you need to step outside. It might be, you need to go to the dean's office. Regardless, that process concludes with that student being assigned some kind of consequence. So that's the sort of getting in trouble piece. Then the punishment piece picks up where that leaves off. So punishment routines start with a student who has been assigned a consequence, and then that consequence can take a variety of different forms, right? So it might be a discipline conversation where you're kind of like, we need to talk about your behavior, this is unacceptable, whatever. It might be calling home, it might be detention, it might be in-school suspension, it might be out-of-school suspension. And the punishment routines conclude when the student has completed their consequence. So when restorative justice practices are integrated into this, there's a few different ways that it can look. One of those ways is that they become sort of an additional option, like a parallel process with the other punishment routines. So when the student is assigned a consequence, Now maybe instead of in-school suspension, it's going to be a peer conference or something like that, right? So this is sort of one way. I saw this happen both at Ruston, my high implementation school, and at Heritage. There was definitely more happening at Ruston, just more peace circles, more peer conferences, more assertive conversations. But when they did happen at Heritage, this is sort of the form that they took. Another way, another strategy for integrating restorative justice into existing discipline routines is through an attempt to kind of transform the existing routine into a more restorative version of itself. Mm-hmm. So taking that discipline conversation where normally those are something of the form of like, you need to realize, whatever, and having that be a conversation that says like, what's going on? Like, tell me what's going on for you. Like, what is it that, was happening for you when you did this thing? What do you think the consequences were for you and your students when you took a turn, right? So it's sort of taking the same person in the same context in the same moment and having the thing that happens there shift or transform to a more restorative version of itself. I saw this happen also both at Ruston and Heritage. At Heritage, the restorative conversations were primarily being held by they had a role that they called a restorative justice dean. And so primarily it was like when students get sent to the dean, now the dean maybe instead of having a blaming conversation is having a restorative conversation. At Ruston, there was, in addition, I should have maybe explained, so Ruston, the main way that they were implementing restorative justice is they had a partnership with a nonprofit, and they had somebody on site, a sort of specialist from a nonprofit on site. I think she was there 3 days a week, and she had an intern another 2 days a week, so it was like sort of almost a full-time equivalent person. At the medium implementation school, they kind of renamed their dean position to be a restorative justice dean, and a couple teachers got training, but that was sort of the extent of it. So at Ruston, where there's somebody there almost full-time who restorative justice is what they do, she was doing lots of restorative conversations. She was also doing lots of training with teachers and encouraging teachers to change their conversations. Like when that student is stepping outside the room just for a moment, you have 1 minute before everything goes crazy to like say something. What is it that you say? And can that be a restorative conversation rather than a more punitive one? At Ruston, they also worked on changing their in-school suspension process so that the idea was when students are sitting in class, are sitting not in class, are sitting in the in-school suspension room, what are they doing at that time? And could what they're doing be a peace circle, be a restorative conversation, be something that's sort of more fruitful? As you can imagine, there are some different implications of these different strategies. I have a sort of whole manuscript that gets into that. That is not the manuscript that I'm talking about today, so I would love to talk about it more if we want in Q&A, but I'm going to just kind of leave it there for now, because I do want to focus on the sort of big picture of institutionalization. And so on that note, I think putting these different pieces together, exclusionary discipline is institutionalized in that district policy documents permit it, and it's sort of recommended for higher level infractions. Student misconduct and exclusionary punishments are measured and reported, and the discipline routines, the getting in trouble and punishment routines are sort of have this interdependence that can be sort of self-sustaining. Restorative justice practices are also permitted by policy documents, and they are integrated into discipline routines at high and medium implementation schools. So this is where I'm sort of saying, like, I would say exclusionary discipline is strongly institutionalized. I would say restorative justice practices are sort of moderate and different school by school. I think this is important for a couple reasons, for sort of substantively. So one is just to recognize that, like, restorative justice is pretty weakly institutionalized at the district level. It's at this status of, like, you are permitted to use it if you so choose. There is some training available. It's not a mandate. There's not a ton of support for it. And it's sort of moderately institutionalized at the school level in some schools. I think it's important also to recognize that the fact that restorative justice is institutionalized somewhat does not actually directly de-institutionalize exclusionary discipline, right? And this is actually a story we see over and over again, that like the sort of new practice, rather than replacing what was already there, it just operates alongside it, and they sort of work in parallel. That's something that I saw here. Actually, sort of even taking it a step further, the fact that restorative justice is being integrated into these discipline routines means there's a sort of interdependence with that traditional discipline, which arguably is counter to the central goal of restorative justice of sort of eliminating exclusionary discipline. There's sort of, you get this kind of connection that could be seen as a sort of uneasy tie. I also want to say that I think there's some kind of methodological contributions to taking this lens to do this work. So, first of all, just to recognize that the approach that I took here is a parallel investigation of the mechanisms supporting both the status quo and the reform. So I'm not assuming that there's nothing to be explained about why what's sticking is already stuck. I want to understand why that thing that's there is continuing to persist, just as much as I want to understand what might make the next thing sticky. The fact that I focused my data collection on these sort of sites or modes of reproduction, one of the things that did for me is it also sort of revealed some absences. So I mentioned that like I noticed the absence of consistent measurement of restorative justice practices or of students' kind of social and emotional well-being, and I noticed the absence of a routine and structured attention to student behavior in these meeting routines. It also means that we can study institutionalization in almost real time, in the sense that most organizational scholarship that looks at institutionalization uses like archival data of 20 years and says like, well, now we can see that that did not stick. Or maybe that it did, right? But that you need this sort of full longitudinal data set to make that assessment. I am arguing that using this lens and this approach where we're saying we have good reason to think that if institutionalization is happening, it's happening at these particular sites, and we can organize our data collection this way, and we can analyze the extent to which this sort of new practice is integrated into those modes of reproduction, lets me know what's going on now. And that's really powerful because it allows for some kind of intervention. It allows for some kind of course correction, right? If things are not sort of taking hold in the way that you might hope. So that kind of takes me to my next to the next piece, which is thinking about how this lens can help offer some design tools for lasting change. So what is a more institutional approach to design research? It says that if we want practices to last, then we want to design for institutionalization. And it sort of offers us a preliminary sort of first design principle, which is that means what I want to do is integrate these practices into one or more of these common modes of reproduction. So this is what I wanted to do, recognizing that, okay, I did this, I did this analysis, I saw really modest evidence of institutionalization, we have good reason to think that restorative justice could hold a lot of promise. What could help it stick? I decided that I wanted to pursue a sort of community collaboration to see if we could do some collaborative design work around this. So I have a partnership with a nonprofit called Alternatives Incorporated. They're a sort of medium-sized youth development agency. They were founded in the 70s. They've actually been working on restorative justice practices in CPS schools since the 90s. In fact, there has been some restorative justice in CPS since the 90s, but very little. And they're currently the largest provider of restorative practices coaching services in the district. So what does that mean? Basically, the idea is that you get this coach from Alternatives who's an expert in restorative justice and restorative practices. They come to the school to help build capacity at the school site so that restorative justice can continue beyond the tenure of the coach. So this idea of sustainability is sort of baked in. And the district contracts with Alternatives to provide these coaching services. The intensity of coaching ranges from the coaches there like 1 or 2 times a week. They've sometimes had 10-week projects. They sometimes had full-year projects. There's some variation there. There's strong kind of channels of communication between Alternatives and the CPS Office of Social and Emotional Learning, but Alternatives also has a lot of autonomy to coach the way they see fit. So I have sort of, for the past 14 months or so, been working collaboratively with them on this design-based implementation research project, or as I like to call it, a design-based institutionalization research project. And our sort of joint design challenge is how can we make restorative just regular? How can that be the default in these schools, right? And so our process of collaborative design, starting not this past summer, but the previous summer, we've sort of had iterations of like refining these how can we questions, brainstorming, prototyping, testing, and also refining our design principles. We also have some kind of research questions as well. So trying to understand, do schools receiving restorative practices coaching from alternatives show evidence of institutionalization of restorative justice practices? And what about schools that received coaching from alternatives previously? Is there any evidence that those practices are sustained, right? And so this is something that our sort of first phase, when we were really in the midst of our first design waves, we were relying on the coaches doing the coaching to kind of tell us like what's going on, what are you seeing in the schools. And we're sort of now starting our kind of more systematic phase of me going to the schools to do some more systematic data collection to kind of to understand what's happening at both current and prior coaching sites. So, give you a little sense of that. So, based on my prior research, based on this sort of organizational literature, these modes of reproduction, we knew that, or we sort of decided that we wanted to try to integrate restorative practices into existing routines at the schools, into measurement systems, and into some kind of like shared professional norms of like how do we do things here. Coaches also had some of their own criteria. It was important that the tools that they were going to use in schools were also helping them to build relationships with people at the schools. Also, if at all possible, if there's something I'm going to do with a group of teachers, if I can say to those teachers, hey, this is something you can use tomorrow in your classroom, I know that's going to help me get some buy-in and get folks to be willing to spend their very precious time with me. So we used a lot of Post-it notes. we did a bunch of brainstorming, and I'm going to show you just one tool that we came up with just to give you a taste of it. So we call this a temperature check. It's basically, there's a series of statements that we like post up on the wall in whatever room we're in that are about staff-staff relationships and staff-student relationships. And team members get little stickers, and you get to sort of vote of like how much do you agree or disagree with these statements. And then the coach sort of facilitates a conversation around what people say. So this is like what the sort of printout might look like. We played around with some different layouts, but this is sort of you can put your sticker anywhere on that number line, or we've also had people do it as like a four corners thing where there's strongly agree, disagree, agree, strongly agree, and people put their stickers. So the idea is to use this at both the start and end of a coaching process, coaching project, and its purpose is several. One is to gather information for the coaches and for the administrators about school climate. Thinking about, is the climate restorative? Is what teachers are experiencing a restorative environment? That's that was sort of a key piece that coaches noted was often missing. We're very focused on the students and what the students are doing, but what's happening for us as staff. It fosters this conversation about a restorative culture among the school staff. And in doing so, it directs attention to sort of potential progress in becoming a more restorative school. And so our design includes a facilitation guide, like posters that you can print out on 8.5 by 11 paper, an online survey version of it, a data template where you can put the data in, all that kind of stuff. And the idea is that this is also something that teachers can readily adapt to implement in your classroom if you want to kind of take the temperature of your own room. So we also came up with a bunch of broader strategies that this tool sort of fits, this and our other tools fit within. So those include, we're going to try to do our coaching within existing team meetings. We're not going to say this is a new extra other thing that you need to do. We're going to say, oh, you already have a grade level meeting? Great, let us come to your grade level meeting, right? We're going to use those team meetings as much as possible as sources of support and accountability, not as places where you receive a 6-hour training spread out over the course of 10 weeks, right? Not that you're just sort of like receiving information, but that you are sharing back with your colleagues, hey, this thing happened with my student, and here's what I said. I had this restorative conversation, here's how it went, right? Or, oh, I didn't have a restorative conversation. Well, why not? Can we problem solve around that? Both at the beginning and sort of throughout the process, the coaches are going to be using some tools to measure a restorative culture, restorative infrastructure, as we're calling it, and restorative skills. And we have some tools to support the practical measurement of student behavioral and social emotional growth. So to sort of bring some more systematicity to that. And I'll just note that these strategies are not, it's not a like one strategy to one mode of reproduction kind of a thing, right? Like one strategy can hit multiple different modes, right? So the fact that I'm working within an existing team, that both is working with the existing routines, but also then we can talk about like, how does the 7th grade team do things, right? We're a restorative team. This is what it looks like for us to work together. So I want to be very clear that this is not a magic bullet. I am very well aware of that. We had our own challenges in implementing things. We had coaches who were like, but I've been coaching individual people for all this time, and why do you want me to change? And, you know. Many schools also do not have the sort of school infrastructure to institutionalize restorative justice readily. So like working in team meetings requires that you have teams that are meeting. And the reality is that's not something that happens regularly at a lot of schools, and so that's a real challenge. Also, there are some limitations that are really sort of coming down from the district level in terms of the scale of support that the district is and is not providing for restorative justice. This is not a district where they've said like, okay, everyone is going to get this training and everyone is going to be, you know, expected to operate this way. It's much more of a sort of like, well, you can do it if you want. You know, and Chicago is it's a very big district. I understand that it would be no small undertaking, but there is some limitation based on that degree of commitment and capacity from the district. Okay, so a couple of contributions. Sort of substantively, I want to note that over the course of this year, one of the things that happened is that I've been meeting with the restorative coaching coordinator every week, and we have a beautiful relationship now. But I think it's worth mentioning that that's valuable. That for those of us that are doing, they're doing work in communities, in context, building those relationships takes a lot of time, and it's really of value. So I want to note that that is one great thing that came out of this. Also, we now have this restorative practices coaching model that is specifically designed for institutionalization being used in schools across the district. So we're trying it. And I think that is sort of a step up in intentionality, if nothing else, from sort of the more ad hoc practices that were there previously. Also, at Alternatives, doing this work has helped them create a stronger internal meeting and professional learning set of routines. Because we realized, like, hey, like, as coaches, it feels like we don't have any time. My main priority is my school, not coming to this meeting on Friday. Like, there end up being this really parallel set of challenges at the nonprofit as the coaches are facing in the schools with teachers. And so it's been an opportunity to say, like, how can we use these same strategies on ourselves? And I think that's been productive. Also, I'm sort of due to share some of these design principles with the district, and I think there's some possibility of them being portable to some other domains, which I'm excited about. The other thing I want to mention in terms of design principles, first of all, is that this is about engaging with strategies for institutionalization from day one. So this is not what I think is a more typical structure of like, okay, we have a 3-year grant, year 1 we design, year 2 we implement, year 3 we institutionalize. No, this is a different approach. This is saying if you want something to stick, that means integrating it into the places, into the modes of reproduction that are going to keep it going, and we need to be working on that from the very beginning. Just to highlight again that the same strategy can engage, though, across multiple modes of reproduction, and that's something powerful to leverage. I also want to mention that these strategies are highly specific in the sense of, you might say, you know, well, gosh, this school, their grade level meetings never seem to happen. Like, they just don't see, it's such a small school, they never seem to be able to get together, but like, they actually do have a pretty robust instructional leadership team. Like, okay, well then maybe we're going to work with the instructional leadership team, right? We're going to sort of think about how can we adapt this into the ILT. So it's very specific in that way, but it's also deeply principled because we're not just saying, well, we'll do whatever we can. We'll say, we'll do what we can that allows us to connect to the school routines, to the school norms, and so forth. Okay, so wrapping up, thinking about implications and future directions. What did I say about what does this tell us about what sticks and why? I'm arguing that this sort of more institutional framework, as I'm calling it, gives us some parsimonious and also actionable answers to that. So practices stick when they are institutionalized, be they old practices or new ones. And practices are institutionalized when they're integrated into self-activating modes of reproduction, and those include policies, routines, norms, metrics, stakeholder interests, frames, or categories. I think they include other things too, but that's a sort of preliminary list. Existing practices will persist until or unless their modes of reproduction are disrupted. And new practices will fade away unless they are integrated into modes of reproduction. Some implications for research. I've tried to demonstrate that scholars can develop an educated guess about whether or not a practice will persist by analyzing its institutionalization in real time. To do this, data collection should be organized around these sort of common modes of reproduction, or sort of our guesses about where the action is going to be happening. And then the data analysis is about really building theory about how different mechanisms of reproduction operate in context. From a sort of design and practice perspective, designers and policymakers can build strategies for sustainability directly into tools and interventions. I think sometimes we think of this as like, well, I made this beautiful thing, but then like, you know, this other thing happened, and so there was nothing I could do, it went away. And of course that happens. Of course, sometimes, often, there are things that we have no control over that happen and things go away. And also, we can be smart and strategic in the way we design things to increase our chances of letting things stick and letting them persist, even in the midst of that turnover. Because as we've seen, some things do stick, despite churn, despite turnover, and so on. And so, like, how do we make our things those things? Doing this kind of real-time analysis of institutionalization also allows for course correction. And so this is there's opportunities while you're still in the field to say, well, how could we try to work on refining our strategies for implementation so that we can do better at integrating them into modes of reproduction? Maybe there's a different one maybe the one we thought we were going to use is not working out so well, maybe there's a different one we can try. So for me, in terms of my sort of next steps with this, I have some ongoing data collection that I'm doing. So one, I mentioned that I saw sort of modest institutionalization at the school level at my medium and high implementation sites. I want to try to sort of give restorative justice and CPS the best possible shot at showing me what high institutionalization looks like. So I'm working on doing some additional field work at schools where it looks like it's sort of going the most deeply integrated into the sort of daily life of the school, whether that be a school with or without coaching support. I'm also doing field work specifically, as I mentioned, at the schools that are getting restorative practices coaching from alternatives, and also schools that received alternatives RP coaching last year. And I'm just beginning to think about what would it look like to evaluate some of these strategies in a quasi-experimental way. So I think we have good evidence from existing literature that these sites of reproduction are associated with longevity, but I would love to be able to test that empirically. And so I'm just starting to think about what that might look like. I think it's really hard, and so if people have thoughts about how I might do that, I'm definitely in the thinking stages there. Thinking about other sort of future directions, I think that we need to know a lot more about these modes of reproduction, like what is influential in what setting, for what kind of practice or outcome, how do multiple modes of reproduction operate together, in a harmonious or a sort of disharmonious way. And I'm interested in thinking about, I applied this in the context of school discipline and restorative justice, but what other context, settings, tools, and interventions might this framework help us understand? So I'm interested in sort of if there's other folks who are like, hey, I'm interested in this in, my setting. I think that's a thing I'd love to pursue. So I want to thank my partners, Alternatives, and the Chicago Public Schools, and also my funders. And also you all for being here, and I'm excited to hear your questions.